So we are Environmental Enforcement Watch, part of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. It is me, Eric, Steve, Kelsey, and Sarah, who aren't here. And then my research assistant at University of Buffalo, Sarah Singh, who's helped put these presentations together. We could move to the next slide. So what is EDGI? And if you haven't heard of us before, we've been in action since November 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, and we anticipated a lot of scrubbing of environmental issues from federal websites, which is what we found, especially in material about climate change. And so it was, we were a lot of academics and also activists, community members, and technologists that came together to do this. And we've really emerged as a collaborative that is focusing on the environmental right to know, and in order to intervene in environmental and technological, especially environmental policy, and that about technological infrastructures in governance. And we've done a lot. So we sounded the alarm when Trump administration removed the climate change pages. Environmental Enforcement Watch, especially found significant declines in EPA's Enforcement Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and other federal environmental laws under Trump. And I'd like to add a chronic lack of enforcement even before Trump. And then we also co-created a searchable public repository of EPA disclosures through FOIA and convinced EPA not to sunset its public web archive. And then something that I've been really part of is the environmental data justice work. And it is more taking a step back and thinking about the theory behind this all, and then how to put that into practice. So really looking towards the principles of equity and decision making, making sure that people are represented equitably, and investigating cumulative impacts, socioeconomic determinants of health, even though our current regulatory systems are not centered around those, and also emphasizing the right to know, along with information access. And accessibility does not necessarily mean availability, right? So then fusing these environmental concerns with data justice and concerns over surveillance and privacy, which might, form a tension between the open data information access portion and not wanting to be surveilled and wanting to keep private. We also have looked at and uncovered data bias and harms in how people are represented by data. And then ew, I always laugh a little bit when I say ew every time. So we're a collaborative project of EDGI, bringing people together to analyze and engage with environmental data, especially the EPA's Enforcement and Compliance History Online database, which is where we all started with noticing the problems in the data and then wanting to make it more accessible, but also contextualizing that data and serving as a resource for people to explore it. All right. The challenges. As I've sort of pointed to before, we have, well, first we have the Clean Air Act language asking, what are the dangers to the public health and welfare from air toxicants? Today we're focusing on air, but this could be expanded to water, soil, everything else. And as I've pointed to, issues in the data include facilities that are regulated individually, yet they pollute collectively. And the tools that we have from EPA and the data really reflect this tension, and that if you go on ECHO, you can explore facilities individually, but not see how many facilities are polluting how much in your region, for instance. And then legislation as well. The data is organized according to legislation, right? So Clean Air Act, RCRA and hazardous waste, Clean Water Act, those have separate legislation, separate data sets, yet toxicants like lead, for instance, move throughout the environment, and the environment doesn't have these pristine boundaries like the legislation and data are creating. And then also facilities are required to report biophysical measures. But as I mentioned before, what about social determinants of health? How do those measures fit in or relate to social environments and infrastructure, the built environment? And there are a lot of questions that we'll talk about in there, but regulatory data also reflects this tension. All right, I'll pass it off to Eric.
Thanks, Lourdes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we work with in the Environmental Enforcement Watch, or EEW, and then we'll move into the demo portion where we'll explore the tool we've made for this particular workshop. So as Lourdes mentioned, we're really focused on contextualizing different sources of environmental data. A lot of focus of our work has been on the Enforcement and Compliance History Online, or ECHO, which compiles state level and federal information from a variety of sources, such as the toxic releases inventory, as well as records of enforcement and compliance actions. And there's a nice interface that the EPA has to engage with that information. You can enter your city. You can then see all the facilities registered in the area, and you can zoom in on any particular facility and learn a lot about it, or at least see a lot of information and records about it. This is a lot of information, and it's not necessarily well contextualized. The limits or the gaps, the missing data aren't necessarily recognized. And it's, again, not summarized across a whole place. It's facility by facility. So there's a lot of information, some of which is wrong, and EPA acknowledges that elsewhere. So what can we actually do with this? And we take up that question by building data analysis notebooks, data science notebooks, as sort of civic technologies for environmental data justice. And that really is intended to address the threat of losing data access by making our own copy of those data sources, routinely updating them, so that if they are, for whatever reason, taken offline during a shutdown or whatever, we have that copy. We are also accessing the full historical set of data from ECHO, as opposed to just the 3 to 5 years of data or records that you can get from their online interface or from echo.epa.gov. We're summarizing that holistically across a place rather than facility by facility, again, to get at the cumulative effects of toxicants. And we're trying to contextualize that information. So give people more of an indication of, well, you may not necessarily want to put so much faith into these numbers because we know there's a lot of data missing there. What does this all look like? Well, that looks like the notebooks, the data science notebooks, an example of which we'll demo in just a second. They include beginner instructions. They have commented code and context there to describe what's happening, what the limitations are all along the way, kind of like a story map if you've ever done one of those. And we're bringing together lots of different data sources, in fact, not just ECHO. So we provide a fuller context to what we're looking at.